Hey all, welcome to Spoonies United. So I want you to put yourself in the following situation. Imagine you're in an unfamiliar city. It's dark outside. You're approaching a dark alleyway. You need to get to the other side of the alley to get to your destination, and you see a suspicious looking person in the alley. Let's say you go ahead and decide to go down the alley anyways, and you're slowly approaching this suspicious looking person. What might be some of the thoughts that start to roll through your head? So a common response might be, well, I might imagine this person pulls a weapon out and tries to rob me. Or I might imagine that they're going to try to hurt me. So are those thoughts accurate? Are they true? And the answer is, of course not. They're not accurate at all. They're completely false. Reality is you're simply walking down in an alley and there is a person, in this example, leaning against the wall. That's it. So why do we have these thoughts that have no truth at all, are completely false? So these thoughts are referred to as fear-based thoughts. So fear stands for false events appearing real. Now, these kind of thoughts, they're also known as imagined outcomes. And these thoughts are actually beneficial. They actually serve a purpose. So they help protect us, help us survive. An example is maybe you're at the dark alleyway, you see the suspicious looking person, you have this imagined outcome in your head that this person is going to pull a knife out and try to rob you, you decide to walk the other way. So these thoughts serve a purpose, but the other thing about these thoughts is they're quick, they're rapid, they're fast. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. These thoughts are designed to protect you. They need to be fast, they need to be reactive. Sometimes you're not even really aware that you're actually having these type of thoughts. You might not even be mindful that these thoughts are occurring. So these thoughts are good, but they can also work against you. So an example might be if you're struggling with an illness, maybe you recently got diagnosed, and maybe the doctor hasn't given you a bad prognosis, but maybe you're having all these imagined outcomes or fear-based thoughts about the future of your health. So maybe you imagine yourself being bedbound one day, or maybe you imagine yourself having to go to the hospital and staying in the hospital long term, or maybe you even imagine yourself dying young. And again, even though the doctor has never said anything to you. Other type of thoughts are automatic as well. So you might be having some automatic thoughts around self-blame. Blaming yourself for your health situation, even though it might not be true. It might not actually be your fault. So in Tony's book, one of the things she says is, our thoughts are not accurate. I actually challenge you to pay attention to your thoughts for like 5 minutes. And what you're going to notice is a lot of your thoughts are actually not true, which is okay. That's fine. It serves a purpose. The problem is we frequently fully believe our thoughts with 100% certainty. And that can cause a strong emotional reaction to our thoughts. So if you notice this person right here, this person is having a ton of thoughts, a lot of automatic thoughts. Maybe they're fear-based thoughts, imagined outcomes. And she's believing these thoughts, and she's having some real strong emotional reactions to these thoughts. So Tony makes a very strong and bold and simple statement in her book. You are not your thoughts. So Tony uses some techniques to try to disassociate herself from her thoughts. She doesn't want to take her thoughts too seriously. She calls that disidentification. One of the techniques she uses to disidentify with her thoughts is something referred to as labeling. So labeling is very simple. So let's look at an example here. So let's say that we have this gentleman right here. Maybe he was recently diagnosed with something and he's having imagined outcomes. And those imagined outcomes I mentioned previously, right? He's afraid he's going to die, go to the hospital, be bedbound, be wheelchair bound, whatever. even though the doctor didn't tell him that. So he's thinking about the worst case scenario, and his body and his mind is believing it. He's getting worked up, and his level of anxiety is greatly increasing. So Tony recommends labeling in this situation. All labeling is labeling the emotion he's experiencing. So he could say, this is fear. This is fear. That's it. That's all you do. Now, why does this help? So frequently what happens is we get so wrapped up in our thoughts. We have like this mental warfare. And that ramps up anxiety, ramps up fear, ramps up depression. What you do when you label is you kind of step outside of yourself and see the bigger picture, and you also kind of disengage from those thoughts. And eventually what will happen is, and it probably won't happen immediately, but eventually when you train your brain to do these kind of things, it's going to take away that fight and allow you to disidentify from those thoughts because you're going to disengage from them. So let's look at another example. So here we have somebody that's maybe struggling with self-blame. They're having a lot of automatic thoughts around blaming themselves. And maybe she's struggling with depression because of that. So all you would do is label. This is depression. This is depression. That's it. A second technique that you can use is creating characters from your thoughts and your emotions. So there's a movie out there. It's actually a really good movie. It's a cartoon, but it's really well done. I recommend it for kids and adults. It's actually really funny. But in the movie, there is a character, and she has a bunch of inner thoughts. And her there's different characters for different emotions. So there is like a character in her head that's like a depressive character. And then there's another character that's angry that lives in her head. There's another character that is like the worrier. And they're each little characters. And so Tony recommends kind of doing a similar thing. So if you're angry and you're upset about your health situation, you can say, hey, this is my character. I'm going to name it Angry Arnold. Or if you're having depressive thoughts, this is my depressive character who lives in my head. This is depressed Darlene. And so that allows you to disidentify from your thoughts and kind of has similar benefits to labeling as well, where you step outside yourself and you don't engage in that mental warfare. And you also kind of accept that not all of your thoughts are actually true or accurate. So I've played around with some of these techniques a little bit. I use labeling sometimes. Now, I'll use an example. So if I'm having some fear-based thoughts like that guy was, where I'm worrying about my health, dying young, going to the hospital, being bedbound, whatever, what I'll do is I'll label it. So I'll say, this is fear, and that helps. And then the other thing I'll do as well is I'll rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. So I might say this is fear on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 5. And the reason I like to rate it is sometimes it keeps it in perspective. So I'm having fear, but it's a 5 out of 10. I mean, it's not great, but it could be worse. And this is something I've been through before. I know I can manage it. Now, the one thing I'll say is when I use labeling, it's not like a light switch. It's not like you label your emotional state and then, oh, I'm going to turn off a light switch. Fear is gone. At least for me, it doesn't work like that. The way it usually works for me is if I have fear and I'm currently on a level 5, I use labeling and I rate it. Maybe it takes me down to a 4 right away. Sometimes it doesn't, but maybe it takes me down a notch. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of lightly pay attention to my emotions over the next 20, 25, 30 minutes and kind of just keep a gauge on my emotional state. And so that helps me pay attention to the bigger picture. I kind of lightly pay attention to the emotion. And what I'll notice is I don't get in that mental warfare. And as time goes by, my fear will slightly decrease. So it goes from a 4 maybe to a 3, and then 10 minutes later down to a 2. The other thing I want to mention goes back to the beginning of this part of the overview. One thing I said is our fear-based thoughts, also known as imagined outcomes, they serve a purpose. They helped protect us. So In some ways, they're good. So when I label instead, sometimes what I'll do instead of using the emotion like this is fear or this is depression, instead what I'll say is this is my survival mind. So an example would be maybe I'm having a lot of imagined outcomes about the future of my health and my anxiety is really ramping up. What I'll say is, hey, this is my survival mind. It's on a scale between 1 and 10. I would say it's about a 5. So I get the benefits of disidentification. It helps me disassociate from my thoughts and kind of, helps with that internal mental warfare. But even more, something more powerful about this is it changes my perception about those fear-based thoughts. So this kind of goes back to something we talked about in a previous part of this overview, is this concept of a paradigm shift. So imagine if you change the way you perceive your fear-based thoughts. If you change your perception about those thoughts, that's going to change the way you feel about those fear-based thoughts and potentially change the way you act. So I definitely encourage you to play around with some of these disidentification techniques. And you can also play around with that concept of also perceiving your fear-based thoughts or imagined outcomes differently. In the next part of this overview, what if you have worries that persist, that you just can't get rid of? Tony uses a 5-step process to work through these worries, and we'll cover that in the next part. Thank you.